Alright guys, I'm going to share a game that I just played against an opponent rated mid 1300s, and it's quite a long one. It's over 80 moves, but what we're going to be looking out for is early mistakes and how those mistakes can kind of start a rot that leads to an ultimate decision on the game. Right? So we have the Vienna game. My opponent plays this c6 move, to which the response is d4. They're immediately striking out for the center. And then they somehow automatically play knight to f6. Now, this is move 3. And the situation is that he has a hanging pawn. So I grab it. And these two pawns in front of it, one in front of the other, now create quite a barrier. It's quite a bone sticking in your throat, really. So the knight has to retreat, actually. Can't go here, here. Hang on, can't go here or here. Can't take that. Can't go there or there because of my queen. So again, the knight just goes back. It's very much like the f takes e5 in the Vienna Gambit. Now I develop my knight, so now this pawn is protected and this pawn is protected. And d6 now, so I take the opportunity to get rid of my doubled pawn, and we have bishop takes. So now we've got a situation where black has no central pawns. I have this one central pawn and a slight lead in development. But now I've got 3 pieces developed to black's 1 because the knight has wasted 2 moves coming out and going straight back. So you can see that move on move 3, bringing the knight out where the pawn could simply be taken and kick the knight away again, has really set black on the back foot. Okay, and now h6, very kind of quiet defensive move, is really neglecting development at this point. So I push e5, hitting the bishop. Now I'd already calculated that the bishop, this is the 20-minute game, right? The bishop's going to have to come back here because if it goes anywhere else, I can capture the queen and force the king to move and lose castling rights. So the bishop goes back. I grab the queen anyway and force this bishop to undevelop itself. So now look at the situation. 1, 2, 3 developed pieces for white, nothing for black, and I'm ready to castle, and I castle. That's now 5 development score. Okay, so 3 pieces off the back rank, and I've castled, and that's worth 2, so that's 5-0 right now. Okay, now we have knight to e7, can't come to f6 because of the evil pawn. I centralize my rook, as makes perfect sense. Now, maybe black should have castled at this point. Instead, they play the bishop out, pinning my knight. I simply break the pin. Have to be conscious that my knight is still pretty much pinned because bishop takes bishop. Oh, it's defended by knight, I suppose. But my idea is now centralize my rook, my other rook. But black here now decides to trade off his developed bishop for mine. So, well, for my knight. So now I've got 2 bishops in a pretty good position. I've got a knight out, I've got a rook centralized, I've completed development, I'm well ahead. So now we have knight coming into d5. And here I decide to swap off the knight, because again, it leaves black with 0 development, okay? This rook can't come out, can't even move, this knight hasn't moved, this bishop hasn't moved, the rook hasn't moved. So now I put my bishop on b4. Because my goal here is I've got my foot on my opponent. He can't get up. It's like he's tied to, he's flat on the canvas, and he's really struggling to do anything. Now what he wants to do is at least to castle his king and get safe. Now he can't do that because the king would have to pass through check, so it's not allowed. Even if he did, he'd lose his rook. Okay, so I'm using this bishop now to pin my opponent down. Alright, so now he brings out a knight attacking the bishop, drop the bishop back to a3. Now he develops a piece and making a tall pawn out of his bishop, joining this, connecting this pawn chain here. So now I play c3, and the idea here is to support my knight. Okay, so I'd like to force an exchange. I'm only up one pawn, but one pawn can make all the difference. In addition, one pawn plus a lead in development and your opponent can't castle can make a world of difference. Right, so this rook is not going to get into the game anytime soon. It literally can't get out. This rook maybe could, so that's probably going to be black's best rook. But I figure if I can get my knight to here, swapping off his bishop or even his knight would be absolutely fine for me. So that's the point of c3. We have a5, and I bring my knight in. I'm not worried about these pawns. And we have a trade of knights, so now white has 2 pawns in the centre. Black has an isolated pawn in the centre that's defended only by this tall pawn bishop. So now he plays b5, and I simply sidestep the issue, place my bishop on here where it's defending my rear pawn of this mini chain and maintaining my hold on the castling path for the king. So rook comes across. I now lift my rook, so now my next attacking idea is this. So I'm switching ideas a lot as I go, right? From tactic here to tactic there. So I want to bring my rook across, maybe force this pawn to move. Right? Black can't castle out of trouble there to defend the pawn because it'd still be passing through check. So black pushes a pawn, I slide my rook across to g3, the pawn has to move. Now my rook comes back across to b3. Because I figure that if he wants to push his pawn, I just grab that one. It's defended by the bishop, no worries. So now, bishop f5. And you have to ask yourself in these situations, or in fact every single situation, why did my opponent play that move? So why did my opponent play his bishop to here? Okay. The only answer I could come up with is he wants to put it here and attack my rook. So, rook to c1, covering this square and preventing this idea. Right? So my opponent will have had a really frustrating time in this game. So now he mobilizes his king, which is great because it gets ready to bring this rook out. The queens are off the board, so castling is not so much of an issue. However, my king is still pretty snug there. So here, this is kind of a waiting move. h3, just taking this square away from the bishop. Just it means the bishop, it can't go there or there or there right now. So if I were to push my f-pawn, he's only got these 2 squares to go on. Black now lifts his rook, and I play my bishop into d6. That's now adding another control over this square. Now I can't play, for example, rook here with check, because simply rook takes, and if bishop takes, king takes, I lose a piece. But it's just exerting more control. Now we have rook to c8, and I decide to trade off rooks. King recaptures, and now a3. If he wants to take with his pawn, no worries, I'll trade off the remaining rook, and then maybe even recapture the pawn with my bishop. So now the bishop comes in, hitting the rook, and now I come up here, looking at the f7 pawn, which I note is protected right now. We have pawn takes, and now bishop takes. And I like this because the bishop is defending the pawn is defending the bishop. There's only one pawn here, so this structure now is immovable. Right? The king can't capture either of these pieces. If should the rook capture either of these pieces, it's going to lose material. Now one thing I noticed here that I missed is rook c3, because that comes with check and attacks the bishop. He can't play rook there because I'd simply capture it, defended by the bishop, and it'd be all over. I missed that in the game, and so I guess if I come here, he's got to get out of check. So even, I don't know, yeah, capture the bishop. I should have been all right there, but this is safe, right? I've got a 1 pawn advantage. Okay, now he comes up here. Hitting my rook, not to worry, rook c3 check, king moves, f3 hitting the bishop, bishop retreats, now rook to c5, okay? Now I've got a fork on 2 pawns. So it doesn't seem like I've got a massive material advantage, but really from this point now, I leverage that advantage and I multiply it. So the rook comes across, I grab a pawn with check. Okay, so the king can't go there. King has to move. King goes to here, and now rook d6 check. Okay, and now the king only has one square it can go to, right? Because he can't go here, 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 or here. It's got to go there. And when he goes there, look at this guy, right? I've got my bishop on a nice diagonal. So there's free stuff around. Now, if I was to move here and try and grab the rook, king would just go there. So I could force a trade of rooks, but that's not free material. So grab a free pawn. King is in check, has to move. Okay, grab another free pawn. And this is the big difference. I saw this check coming. It's not scary. Rook comes back up again. No threat whatsoever there. So throw in another check. King moves. And now I drop my rook back. Now, why did I play this move? Well, there's a couple of things. One is I'm kind of looking at that pawn, but the real threat is I want to fork the king and the rook and force an exchange of rooks. So bishop now comes down, and I force an exchange of rooks. Okay, so there we go. So now I'm 4 pawns up. Okay, I just need to convert, but it's not as simple as it looks. So I start to mobilize my king. We have pawn to a4, which does nothing. Centralizing the king, making sure to step on the dark colored squares. And this actually turned out to be a little trickier than I thought. So we'll play through the moves fairly quick. A lot of backwards and forwards. Now, according to the engine, this was a blunder. Moving this pawn forward was a blunder. It says I should have done that. But then I guess pawn takes... then I could have maybe advanced my pawn and maybe got my king behind that pawn. That's a possibility. But anyway, I pushed this. Apparently it's a blunder. Bishop comes up, and now I'm just maneuvering round and round and round. I need to make sure that I've got this guarded, so my bishop needs to stay on this diagonal. Although the pawn can just snatch it off if it moves as well. And now I start to maneuver my king all the way around here. It only takes one pawn to get a queen and win the game, right? So I come here after this pawn. So I grab the pawn off. And obviously I'm now sacrificing potentially this entire trio, but it doesn't matter if I can convert. Okay, so the bishop comes up now defending this guy. King moves back, now attacking this one. Bishop comes back, king goes back, and I thought, sod that, let's just crack on and try and convert. So throwing a pawn up the board. Here my opponent should probably have dropped his bishop to here to guard this square. But he comes here with a check, I push on, he comes up, and now I know that if I advance this pawn, he's going to have to capture, and he's lost his bishop. Now, I've got a bishop and 2 pawns, untouchable. Untouchable by the king. King can't capture any of these pieces. The only real move he's got is this. It's going to be met with a capture. And I just have to make sure that I convert the win. This is what you do in the endgame. This is your default in the endgame. What is the best result possible? And make damn sure it happens. So, pawn advances. Snatch off the pawn. I mean, I couldn't assume that he's going to capture me and then I recapture. He could have just made a dash for the line, and then I guess, yeah, it's a couple of moves for my bishop to come around and meet that. So I think let's get rid of the pawn. And now king d5. And the king can't go on any of these squares now. So the king goes there. I move my king. And now check. Now the king moves to e8. Now, you've got to be aware of this. This is so common, right? It doesn't matter whether this is a pawn or a bishop. If you've got this situation, black's king actually is moved onto his only square. He can't go here, because of my bishop, or here. So if I'd have just absent-mindedly pushed my pawn, stalemate, draw, losing points. Okay, so I have to move the bishop to allow him to come to here. Can't go there still because of the bishop, can't go there. He's only got one square. There we go. And now the pawn comes up. The king just has to move backwards and forwards. Now the king can't come back here because the pawn's guarding that square. King has to move here, and bang, checkmate. Okay, pinning the king onto the side of the board, supported. very simple checkmate in the end. But I thought that was an interesting game. And I think black's woes started here. Move 3, leaving this hanging pawn. Okay? And so far he'd taken 1.5 seconds on his first move, 2.5 seconds, and then 5.8 seconds for move 3. Immediately losing material, but more important than that, losing control over the centre. Knight has to retreat, he's lost development. He advances a pawn. It gets removed straight away. So now black doesn't have these central pawns, right? So the moral of the story is don't absent-mindedly make your first few moves in a game, particularly if it's an opening you're not very familiar with. But even if it is an opening you think you're familiar with, always pay attention. You've got to tell the story of the board, right? Come back here. Okay, with this, what changed? What changed on the board? What is my opponent trying to do? Well, what's changed is this pawn has moved from there to there. So it's no longer controlling these squares, but it is now attacking these squares, right? Okay, so the pawn is attacking this square, attacking my piece. Is it defended? No, it isn't. Right, that's all you have to do. This is the checklist. Knight out there, no good. And the knight literally has nowhere to go, has to retreat. And black is already in arguably a losing position at this point in time. It's going to be so much harder. So he can't bring his knight here. He can't bring his bishop here, right? There's so many things he can't do because he's just lost his grip on the opening from move 3, right? And now it just gets worse and worse, really. So he never really gets that opportunity. Now I swap off queens and force his bishop to undevelop, and now he has 0 development. Now I castle. Okay, and wouldn't you rather be white in this situation? So there you go. The lesson of this is, doesn't matter if it's move 2 or 3 or whatever, always tell yourself, talk through what changed, what's different on the board, what the new threats are, what the new opportunities are. You've just got to be blooming autistic about this. Just say, these are the facts, right? These are the facts, this is the information that's on the board, and play the actual board, not the image that you've got of the game in your head, right? Play what's on the board and you'll do better. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.